Yeah, so you may have run across 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell's essay, Why I Am Not a Christian. Some of you familiar with that? It was originally presented by him in 1927 as a lecture, and it remains in print to this day. And his rejection of Christianity is based on his intellectual objections to arguments for the existence of God and his moral criticisms of Christianity and religion in general. In addition to being a philosopher, mathematician, logician, and Nobel laureate in literature, Russell, who died in 1970, was also a vocal critic of war, religion, authoritarianism, and he championed reason and intellectual freedom throughout his life. So definitely a kindred spirit. And it was Russell who inspired the title of today's sermon, Why I Am Not a Unitarian Universalist, and my reasons for which are essentially the same as his were for renouncing Christianity. I strongly disagree with the irrational and illiberal ideological turn Unitarian Universalism has taken in recent years, and I'm even more strongly repulsed by its authoritarianism, intolerant, and unethical behavior toward others, representing the very antithesis of my deepest values. While I remain proud to be associated with the ideas and the values that Unitarian Universalism inherited from its two namesakes, and once embraced, today I'm embarrassed to have my name attached to UUism or to the Unitarian Universalist Association and refer to myself as a Unitarian in the traditional sense. Speaking of which, one of Russell's contemporaries, only 6 years younger, and another kindred spirit was none other than John Dietrich, the father of religious humanism and once minister of our Spokane congregation, of whom many of you know I often speak. Only 2 weeks ago, in fact, I revised and delivered his sermon, Who Are These Unitarians? Originally given in 1926, only months before Russell first presented his now famous critique of Christianity. Contemplating and preparing Dietrich's sermon in particular brought greater clarity to my own reasons for now rejecting Unitarian Universalism, a religion that was established only as recently as 1961, which is why researchers and social scientists refer to it as an NRM, a new religious movement, even though Unitarianism and Universalism have separately existed for centuries. Sadly, the UUA has had an identity crisis ever since the association was formed, which has only worsened over the years to the point that today its entire reason for being seems to be for the purpose of idolizing, that is, making idols out of or worshiping the identities of others. That's what it's become a religion of. Now, I've been speaking about these concerns for decades. In 2012, for example, only a year after I arrived in Spokane, I gave a sermon entitled The UU Identity Crisis, Moving Beyond Our Denominational Adolescence, in which I stated, we still haven't come to thoroughly agree upon what it is about or what holds us and our values and differences together. We've been exploring a few different identities, but haven't yet committed to any. A simple elevator speech explaining what Unitarian Universalism is remains as elusive as a high-resolution image of a Bigfoot or a UFO. Yet the aforementioned sermon, Dietrich's aforementioned sermon, given in 1926, 35 years before the UUA was formed, provides us with a one-sentence definition of Unitarianism with clarity and ease. Religious freedom, accompanied by Unitarianism, simply asserts that anyone, white or black, rich or poor, ignorant or educated, Jew or Gentile, bond or free, Christian or pagan, orthodox or heterodox, theist or atheist, is entitled to think as he sees fit and yet not be denied the right of fellowship. He also said, we must proclaim to people everywhere that here in our Unitarian fold is a place where they may follow truth to its uttermost bounds and still enjoy the privilege of religious fellowship. More simply stated, Unitarians come together regardless of any differences because of our common devotion to freedom of thought. And I put it this way because it puts the primary emphasis on freedom of thought, the fundamental principle that draws and keeps us together. But soon after its inception, the Unitarian Universalist Association began emphasizing the differences part, as if these are what bring us together and keep us together. Right from its start in 1961, the UUA began assessing itself in an attempt to figure out what this new religious movement was going to be about. Isn't that strange? Having recently began the North American Unitarian Association, NAUA, based explicitly upon the principles of freedom, reason, tolerance, and human dignity, it's difficult for me to grasp how an organization like the UUA could have formed without fully understanding what it was going to be about to begin with. Who does that? Let's start a religious association, then figure out what it's going to stand for. In 1963, it published the results of its assessment in a report entitled The Free Church in a Changing World. According to historian David Robinson, it suggested a pattern of increasing religious pluralism and a simultaneous need to discuss consensus or identity with that pluralism. There's that word identity again, suggesting the identity crisis that I have spoken about often started at the UUA's very inception. More importantly, by emphasizing our many differences, the report failed to focus on freedom of thought as Unitarianism's foundational, historic, and defining quality. It even goes on to disparage the idea that this was enough to base its new religious movement on. In the report's concluding remarks, Reverend Paul Carnes, who was later elected to lead the UUA, as its president, stated, religious liberalism has little to meet the challenges of today's needs or win our own personal need. If all it offers is a casual join us and you can believe anything you want, as if religious conviction were to be left to such ephemeral judges as whim and wish. In 1961, the UUA started another survey in another attempt to figure itself out. The results published in 1967, based on responses from over 12,000 members from 800 congregations, indicated that less than 3% claimed to believe in a universal being, or a supernatural being, I should say. 28% considered God as an irrelevant concept. 57% did not consider theirs a Christian religion, and 52% preferred a distinctive humanistic religion. I take this to mean that most Unitarians, or UUs as they were increasingly calling themselves, didn't simply believe anything they wanted based on wish or whim, as Carnes complained, but took what they chose to believe seriously enough to apply sound reason to their thinking. They had reasons for what they believed. Good reason. 40 years later, however, such consensus had vanished, as indicated by a 2005 survey that simply asked, what holds us together? Participants, it's remarkable, after all those years, it still doesn't know what holds it together, what it's about. Participants responded by saying things like, it's the support network. The UU movement is an interreligious dialogue. UU have cups, that's a pagan group, and the Buddhist and the Christians and all these little subgroups because we offer the hope of a spiritual journey and we offer no tools to do it with. Another says, I'm no longer convinced that you can have the omni-inclusive church, you can have the one-size-fits-all church, or even the one-size-fits-all denomination. Then, with a tone of defeat, the report concludes, despite consensus within the church that the liberal message of Unitarian Universalism is important in this troubled world, we find it difficult to articulate that message clearly. We have a very important message. We just don't know what it is. It's sad enough that the founders of the UUA began their new religion with little idea and less conviction of its purpose. A flaw, as the evidence I presented shows that has led to decades of increasing confusion about the fledgling offshoot of a much older religion that was once profoundly committed to and confident of its belief, of its purpose, freedom of thought, the only means by which people of diverse opinions can come together and live and work and worship. Our religion was never supposed to be about diversity, but about the freedom that leads to diversity. But the UUA has forgotten, if not discarded, the oldest and most fundamental tenet of our liberal religion, the very thing that draws us and binds us together. We're not here for the diversity. We're here because we value the freedom to think for ourselves and to live peacefully together in that process. The UUA included a list of 6 statements in its original or founding bylaws, which were slightly altered and a 7th added in 1985. For many UUs, these 7 principles articulated their religion perfectly. I like them, and I consider them an adequate, although wordy, articulation of our values. Yet I have long been troubled that they were scribed within the UUA bylaws, which is supposed to be a service organization, not a religious denomination. Here's what Dietrich said of its predecessor, the AUA, the American Unitarian Association, in again the aforementioned sermon. This organization is without ecclesiastical authority whatever. It is simply an association of free and independent churches for purely missionary purposes, using annual contributions from the churches and income from their trust funds for publishing books and tracts, sustaining missionaries in new fields, aiding feeble churches, and planting new ones. Not telling us what to think. He also said Unitarianism cannot be viewed historically from the standpoint of a type of thought, and that no one can speak authoritatively of the doctrines of Unitarianism. And Unitarianism cannot be judged by the teaching of any individual society, because each society has the perfect right to formulate for itself any creative desires, to practice any rituals it pleases, and to establish any policy it sees fit. Now that's liberal. So the only proper place for an articulation of our religious liberal principles is within our local congregations as determined by its members. Since 1985, too many of us have come to treat these principles like our version of a creed. And while I agree they are worthy of setting aside for consideration and inspiration now and then, so are a lot of other writings. Unitarianism should not treat any writing as the final summation of our religion, nor agree upon one set of principles housed within the bylaws of a national service organization. Alas, if this were my only worry about the UUA, it would merely be a point worth raising in a sermon now and then, as I have sometimes done. Nobody remembers. Eddie. Or in discussions with other religious professionals from time to time. But it's by no means a deal breaker for me, right? What is a deal breaker is JETPIG. That's the acronym, for those who don't know, for the 7 euphemisms that recently replaced the 7 principles. JETPIG stands for justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity with love at their core. Right? So the image really is of a jet, of a pig flying in a jet fueled by love. They couldn't find a word that they could include L in the acronym, so that's just added on, right? So anyway, that's so deep. That's so deep compared to our ancient tradition. I think ChatGPT came up with that. I do. The UUA's most recent newsletter says, "We must be intentional about moving fear out of the center and replacing it with love, over and over again, as often as necessary." Sarcasm is added. The UUA's president then says, "May we do this work on centering love, connected as a faith and in our own communities. Centering love in all we do is the new mantra of the UUA." Now, love is not a bad word. Indeed, it has already been claimed as the core tenet of other religions, including Christianity and Buddhism. But love is so vague. It is so vague as to be almost meaningless if not well defined, and has often been used to justify all manners of evil. More importantly, from our perspective as religious liberals, it is not our defining principle, no matter how sweet its ring. The UUA newsletter begins by saying, "We know that our ministries unfold in challenging and complex times." This is so. But nebulous love is not what is needed for us to face these challenges. As Dietrich said, we are needed today as never before, and no fear of denominationalism, no sentimental love of church unity, no mush of concession, as Emerson phrased it, must be allowed to turn us from the task which is this day laid upon our shoulders. The reason we are needed today now more than ever is not because of some sugary, sanctimonious word that has been failing as a religious core for 2,000 years, but because, as Dietrich further stated, we must proclaim to people everywhere again that here in our Unitarian fold is a place where we may follow truth to its utmost bounds and still enjoy the privilege of religious fellowship. All of this gets at my ideological differences with what has become of the UUA. It is a religion that no longer emphasizes nor values the part of liberal religion that makes it liberal: liberty, the principle of religious freedom. Indeed, so many of the terms once definitive of liberalism, words like freedom, reason, independence, not interdependence, independence, democracy, individuality, dignity, have been positioned obscurely and out of context, buried within the UUA's bylaws, or removed from it altogether. Since it has finally, after 65 years, finally defined what Unitarian Universalism is, with a definition that has nothing to do with its liberal heritage, nothing to do with a fundamental commitment to freedom of thought and belief, it is not a liberal organization, and I therefore am not a Unitarian Universalist. Still, based on its short history, I consider what's happened to the UUA to have been inevitable, but not intentional or malicious. By focusing on the diversity part of the equation from the start rather than on the freedom, it increasingly became an association in search of a common core, not realizing that it already had one. And this created an opportunity for opportunists who, over the past few decades, limited the association's once expansive democratic governance into the hands of a small number of individuals who now control the organization and make it effectively impossible for anyone to run against the leaders that it self-selects. It's one of the worst examples of institutional capture that I know of, which begins to get us to the ethical reasons for which I can no longer, in good conscience, consider myself a Unitarian Universalist. If becoming so undemocratic weren't enough, it's intolerance and it's bullying. It's bullying of those who openly disagree with the illiberal direction the association has taken leaves me with no choice but to disassociate from it. As you know, I wrote a book about my concerns, which I began freely distributing at the UUA's General Assembly in 2019. Within hours, I was corralled into a corner by 5 UUA representatives complaining about the terrible harm that my book was causing, though none of them had read it or could point to any examples. When I got home that evening, I received a phone call from another representative instructing me not to return to the General Assembly. 24 hours later, more than 300 UU ministers, eventually more than 500, issued a public letter condemning me and my book, which few of them could have read, considering I gave out less than 200 copies before I was booted out. Condemning me as a racist, homo, and transphobic ableist classist, which nobody has ever pointed to a single sentence in there to validate this, no matter how often they have been asked. A month later, I received a letter of censure from the UU Ministers Association repeating these assertions, again without citing a single example. At the same time, I received a notice from Meadville Lombard Theological School where I earned my doctorate that my position as an adjunct professor had been terminated without explanation. By the end of that year, I was officially disfellowshipped by the UUA for being a non-cooperative, abusive bully. Incidentally, they have recently removed the abusive bully part. Don't know why. You would think an ethical organization, after making a mistake like that publicly, would issue an apology and explanation as to why they removed it, right? Now I'm just non-cooperative. True. More disturbing, during this tumultuous year, UUA officials were routinely and secretly meeting with a small number of those within our congregation here in a joint effort to force me out, which is a violation of its own code of ethics. I stumbled upon one of these meetings and was told by our then board president, who was visibly shaken by my intrusion, that I could not attend. We've also since discovered an email regarding the UUA's executive vice president who met with our board to discuss how best to terminate me. When this effort failed, those wishing me gone after failing to overturn our own election here abruptly left, immediately went to the press to falsely disparage our church, then attempted to form their own fellowship. In less than a year, during the COVID lockdown at that, the UUA officially recognized it as a breakout church serving the inland Northwest. Not only was this unprecedented after such a short time, and I know how these little fellowships used to get treated because I complained about it a lot. that the UUA had to ease up and let them in. Of course, I've lost my place here. Well, it's unprecedented for such a small congregation, only been around such a short time, and had never even met in person. And it was against the UUA's own rules about contacting the existing congregation before making such a decision, especially knowing that it had been the result of a split. Now, we, of course, wouldn't have gotten in the way if they want to recognize a new fellowship in town. Absolutely. Go for it. The point is, you didn't follow your rules. And it was an intentional attempt to undermine us once again. And that's really what bothers me most about this period. That's why it's so disturbing. The UUA had rules in place that required them to prioritize for the welfare of our congregation. Whether they liked me or not, that was their job. Instead, they used us for their own means, willing to cause whatever damage necessary to our congregation just to get rid of me. They had the tools and they had the rules to help keep us together, but they didn't care about the welfare of this congregation any more than they cared about my dignity as an individual, nor my freedom of the pulpit as a Unitarian minister. In his 1926 sermon, Dietrich said, "Each Unitarian society guarantees its minister absolute freedom of thought and expression." A Unitarian principle that dates all the way back to the Edict of Torda in 1568. Indeed, between 1961 and 2020, when I became the first minister ever disfellowshipped as an abusive bully, the UUA had permanently disfellowshipped only 8 ministers, 7 for sexual misconduct and 1 for financial malfeasance, legitimate reasons, right? Between 1961 and 2020. Between 2020 and today, 5 years later, 5 years compared to nearly 6 decades, there have been 8 of us disfellowshipped on charges like bullying and abusive behavior, non-cooperation, and creating hostile work environments. The most recent was removed for, quote, bullying and abusive behaviors in the workplace. That is, for being a boss, which is a congregational matter and has nothing to do with the UUA. But now, a disgruntled employee complains to the UUA and it acts like it's an autonomous congregation's personnel department. They're acting like we ministers work for them. Ugh. Getting myself worked up. Eddie, you want to sing a song? No. The authoritarian overreach, and more troubling, the removal of ministers for simply saying things that others disagree with, for simply doing our job, labeling their comments as bullying, abusive, or hostile, violates our liberal religion's first and most sacred principles: freedom of the pulpit and independence of the local congregation. Finally, in recent years, the UUA has, in my opinion, been bullying small congregations that rebel against its illiberal behavior. One is a newly formed small fellowship that split off from a larger congregation in protest of what's been happening. The other is an established church that recently left the UUA over these matters. Both received legalistic, threatening cease and desist letters, not from an attorney, but from the association's executive vice president, maybe he is an attorney, I don't know, claiming that the UUA owns the rights to the terms Unitarian and Universalist, or Universalism, to the 7 principles, even to the image of a chalice. In the most recent letter claimed the congregation was causing irreparable harm to the UUA and must not only immediately stop using the UUA's specific trademark, but must also stop using the term Unitarian Universalist altogether. Without the resources to wage a legal battle of any sort, this caused the congregation to shut down its Facebook page and other communication mediums for fear of being sued by this behemoth. And while it can claim the rights to its specific trademark, its specific image, it's highly unlikely that it can claim the right to Unitarian Universalism, even if they somehow got those words trademarked. It'll never hold up in court. Unitarianism has been around hundreds of years. There's many Unitarian and Universalist organizations around the world. It can't be trademarked. They know it wouldn't hold up. Let alone to any image of the chalice or the 7 principles which it went on to abandon. You can't trademark principles. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, that comes out of the French Revolution. It's in our constitutions. Come on. But the real question is, who's doing the bullying? Who's doing the bullying? Ministers and members who protest the UUA's illiberal direction, or the UUA, which has become extremely intolerant of any criticism or questions. A couple of weeks ago, I participated in a public demonstration raising awareness about the threat to freedom and democracy in our nation. I noticed a few people there who'd been part of the splinter group that left our church in 2020. One of them had actually written us a note saying that they would stop contributing to our church because we no longer represent their values. It's fine, you shouldn't be part of a church that doesn't represent your values. This same person once met with me, however, and asked that I renounce my book in order to heal the rift in our church. I said, as I said to many at the time, if healing our church is the church's priority, it needs another minister. I am not the person to heal this church. That is not my job. My job is to uphold our liberal principles and our liberal values. Another individual marching for freedom had overtly stated that I should never have written my book without the congregation's input and approval. Like the CIA. I mean, this despite a clause in my ministerial agreement that states explicitly, it is a basic premise of this congregation that the pulpit is free and untrammeled. The minister is expected to express his values, views, and commitments without fear or favor. When I spotted them at that demonstration, I wondered why it was okay to protest a Republican threat to our freedoms, but not an internal threat within our own religion, just to keep the peace. Jesus is reported to have said, "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and the dog against the cat." He didn't say it. I doubt if Jesus actually said any of that. But I do appreciate the sentiment. Because there are a few lines in the sand that we must stand behind to protect. As a religious liberal, especially as a Unitarian, especially as the minister of the Unitarian Church of Spokane, established in 1887, whose first principle, its bylaws say, is freedom of opinion and is subject to no censure for heresy. The Church of Reverend Edwin Wheelock, our first minister, who came to us with a bounty on his head for preaching in favor of abolition. The pulpit of the convicted heretic, John Dietrich, and of Rudy Gilbert, for those who remember Rudy, who was among the very first preachers brave enough to use this pulpit to speak against the Vietnam War. And the Reverend William Houff, who used it to take on the federal government that was secretly exposing people to radiation at the Hanford nuclear facility. I can no longer count myself as a Unitarian Universalist on the ideological grounds I have mentioned, but most importantly because its intolerant, bullying, and abusive behavior in recent years comes to represent the very antithesis of what we have long considered, as Dietrich said, the very foundation stone of the Unitarian faith, the belief that truth should be taken as authority and not authority as truth. Thank you.